Welcome back to the Jewish Futurism Lab, where we unpack Torah, tech, and tomorrow. I'm Mike Wirth, Jewish futurist, community artist, and design educator, coming to you from Crown Town, Charlotte, North Carolina. Today we're going to ask a quieter question beneath all of the hot takes on AI and art. What do we really mean when we say something is creative? We'll bring the 4C model of creativity into conversation with Jewish history and exile, and look at how we can see the same pixels, galleries, and feeds, yet read them completely different when something new appears. Then we'll ask what it means for Jews to take up these tools and say, no, this is how we will build our future. Let's get into it, y'all. So let's start by naming this quiet question. Creativity is one of those words that we use constantly, but almost never define. We point at a painting, a film, a unique business idea, a really clever joke, and we say, that's so creative. But underneath that compliment, we may be talking about completely different things. Sometimes we may mean originality. We've never seen anything like this before, so creative. Sometimes we mean emotional impact. This really moved me, and it will stay with me now. Definitely creative. Sometimes we mean moral courage. It has said something risky or true, and wow, that's creative. And sometimes we just mean authorship. I can feel a real person's story inside of this object or image or song. Now we add AI into the mix, and everything gets a heck of a lot noisier. An image model spits out an image or a melody that looks or sounds new. Is that creative? If we say no, what exactly are we protecting? And if we say yes, what are we giving away? To make sense of this, I want to do three things in today's episode. First, I'll introduce the 4C model of creativity, a way psychologists talk about creativity as a path rather than an on and off switch. Second, I'll place the model inside the Jewish story, how Jews have used creativity as refuge and as world building, especially in exile. Third, I'll bring in AI, the aura of art, and Jewish futurism to ask, what is creativity now, and what responsibilities come with the power to build worlds through images, stories, and code? But first, let me take you back to grad school for me at Parsons in New York City around 2001. Now, the philosophy of the program that I was in, MFA-DT, was to build classes of artist, designer, coders. And I was deep in the ones and zeros of generative art, trying to recreate El Lissitzky on a screen for a project. I wrote this little program that made shapes drift and rearrange themselves, a new composition every time that the code ran on the screen. I had absolutely written the code, but the computer was producing the actual art. This was my first encounter with what I later would learn to call parametric design, where you don't place every box or pick every color. You write a series of instructions and rules, and you watch a system respond. I felt weirdly split on this, totally in charge of my idea, but not in the nitty-gritty of the image making. I remember classmates in other programs would ask, so are you the artist or is the computer the artist? I didn't have a clean answer for them. It made me feel uneasy, but it also made me feel powerful, like I had stumbled into an art form that almost nobody around me had language for yet. That tension between authorship and system is the same knot we're still pulling on now with AI. So, with that question hanging in the air, let's put some structure underneath it and talk about this 4C model of creativity. So, back in 2016, psychologists James Kaufman, Ronald Bagetto, and Max Helfand proposed something called the 4C model of creativity. Their idea is simple. Instead of treating creativity as a yes-no trait, they describe it as a spectrum within 4 levels. The first level is mini-C. Mini-C is the private spark that happens within you. It's the inner aha moment that clicks. You might be reading a text, listening to music, or sketching in a sketchbook, and suddenly your understanding shifts. No one else sees it or hears it. There's no product yet, but your inner world just rearranged itself a little bit. The second is little c. Little c is the spark that happens in others. Little c is everyday creative action. The recipe you tweak, the layout you rearrange, the new melody you try for a line of liturgy, the tiny design decision you make that solves a problem at work. Little c is creativity of daily life, seen by people around you, but not necessarily professionalized. The third level is called Pro C. Pro C is where creativity becomes vocation and craft. You've put in your years of practice. You have your 1,000 hours on your tools and you understand your field. Your peers recognize your work as original and solid. You might still feel like an imposter on the inside, but from the outside, people can see that this isn't just dabbling for you. It's a discipline. There's a professional recognition. Clients and customers are happy. But this doesn't quite reach the legendary level of the fourth C. The fourth C is called Big C, and Big C is extremely rare. It's field-changing creativity. The discoveries, moments, or artworks that permanently alter how people in a domain think, feel, or create. These are the names that end up in history surveys and retrospectives. The key insight of the 4C model is that creativity is not binary. Everyone has access to mini c and little c. With support and persistence, some people move into Pro C, and the select few get into Big C. Creativity becomes a life path with stages, not a mysterious lightning bolt that strikes a chosen few. When I think about mini C, I think about the quiet moments in my own practice where something in Jewish text suddenly shifts. That's really where my Hidor Olam project work began. Sitting with the weekly parashiot, the Torah portion, I'd get these little flashes of what if this verse looked like a circuit board, or what if this story was a city map? Those weren't finished pieces, just private clicks in my own head. Little c showed up when I started sketching those flashes instead of ignoring them. I'd filled pages with thumbnail drawings, strange hybrid symbols, layouts, and treated Torah like a design system. Some of these sketches turned into small studio projects, some into workshop exercises where I asked students to diagram a text instead of just, talking about it. Over time, that became Pro C. The same instincts that drove those tiny experiments grew into full mural projects for me, lectures, and eventually into what is being known as the Jewish futurism guy here in Charlotte and beyond. Institutions started calling not just because I could paint a wall, but because I had a clear vision for Torah, memory, and future. And that's when I realized this wasn't my private way of learning. It was actually my vocation. And that's why I created the Hador Olam book series. So that's how the 4C path has shown up in my life. Let's zoom that out and place the whole spectrum inside a Jewish frame now. If you zoom out on the last century or so, a pattern starts to appear. Jews are a tiny fraction of the world's population, yet a disproportionately large share of recognized creative and intellectual work has come from Jewish individuals in science, literature, film, music, design, and other world-building fields. The exact number varies by source, but they routinely show recognition far above what population alone would predict. I don't bring this up to brag. I bring it up because it calls for explanation. Here is a thesis I want to hold lightly but seriously. Jewish life has functioned in practice as a creativity incubator, not because of some mystical creative gene, but because our texts, practices, and historical conditions have trained us to live by questions, to imagine alternative worlds, and to survive between cultures. Consider a few ingredients. From childhood, many Jews are taught to argue with texts, with teachers, sometimes even with God. We're encouraged to ask why and what if, and how else could this be read? That is training in divergent thinking. We inherit a tradition where midrash, the creative expansion of stories, is central. We take a short biblical scene and spin entire worlds of commentary around it. That is world building, my friends. Historically, many Jews have lived as minorities at cultural crossroads, navigating life in more than one language and system at once. That is training in hybridity. in seeing multiple perspectives at once, in spotting the cracks where new forms can grow. When you add those together, it becomes less surprising that many Jews find themselves drawn to creative fields. The 4C path feels familiar because our tradition has been walking in its own way for centuries. So let's return here to mini C for a second. In Jewish terms, you can think of mini C as my own Torah, the unique way a verse, a prayer, a ritual, or historical moment reconfigures something inside of you. You read a parsha you've read every year, or maybe for the first time, and suddenly a word you never noticed feels central or brand new. You stand in Amidah prayer and realize that one line is speaking directly into the week that you've just had. You sit with a midrash and it opens a door to your own story that you didn't know was there. No one else hears that inner dialogue, but it's totally real. That's mini C creativity happening in the medium of your own consciousness and imagination. Now, little c appears when you give that inner shift some form. You write a small poem on the back of your siddur, your prayer book sheet. You sketch a motif from the parsha into your notebook. You design a tiny ritual tweak around a life event. You visualize a piece of Torah as a data diagram, or as a city, or as a user interface with buttons that you can push. Those little C acts may never hit Instagram. They may only touch a handful of people, but in Jewish life, that is where much of our daily world building happens. We translate inherited texts and symbols into forms that fit into our actual lives, our bodies, and our neighborhoods. For many Jews across time, especially in precarious conditions, these acts of making have been literal refuge. So here's a little story. After October 7th, everything in my feeds and text threads felt like it was vibrating. I was getting this flood of messages, some from friends checking in, some compassionate, but a lot of them soaked in anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist venom. I felt like I was sitting Shiva with my phone instead of with my own people. Out of that, I made digital illustration called Shirked Shiva. It's an image of a silhouetted man slumped in a chair, surrounded by glowing phone screens. Each screen holds fragments of real texts and posts that I received in those first few days after October 7th. It was my way of saying, this is what it feels like when grief, fear, and everyone else's hot takes are all pinging you at once. I submitted the piece to a group show of Charlotte-based artists. The guest curator accepted it, but the chief curator pulled it, saying they were acting in the protection of the Jewish community and that viewers wouldn't understand what I'm saying and might get angry. I remember thinking, isn't this what art is for? To hold the uncomfortable thing we don't yet understand? Even if it could hang on their wall, it still functioned as refuge for me. It told the truth of what my community and I were feeling and reminded me that my job is to insist that our grief and perspective belong in that room. That is why when I mean by saying that creativity is a refuge. Let's look at what happens when that refuge grows into full-blown pro-C and then the occasional big C. So as these patterns repeat over years, you begin to recognize pro-C. You become someone who creates regularly, takes feedback seriously, builds a body of work, and starts to influence how others think, pray, learn, or create. In Jewish terms, pro-C shows up in rabbis, educators who craft new curricula and liturgies. It shows up in artists and designers whose work circulates widely within Jewish spaces. It shows up in people building speculative projects around Jewish futures, not as one-off experiments, but as sustained practice. Pro-C is where responsibility thickens. You are no longer just playing for yourself. Your work shapes other people's inner and outer worlds. Big C is rarer still. That's when a particular Jewish creative life, a mystical system, a movement, a body of art, a mode of storytelling, permanently expands what Judaism can be. It might be a visual language that becomes synonymous with a movement. It might be a speculative vision that influences how Jews and non-Jews picture Jewish futures. Now add another layer, the youngness of Jews in the canon of Western art history. Because of anxiety around graven images and because of our minority status, much of Jewish visual art historically lived in spaces that art history did not always value. Things like manuscripts, ritual objects, murals inside of synagogues, textiles, calligraphy, and some typography. From the outside, that can look like Jews didn't make art for very long, did they? And only recently joined the story of modern art. From the inside, that narrative is false. Our commandments about images are not a blanket ban on creativity. They are an early media ethics guide, in my opinion. They acknowledge that images are powerful, that they can capture and distort, that they can become idols unto themselves. In that sense, Torah is not anti-art. It is pro-responsible art. It commands us to be extremely careful about what we represent, how we represent it, and what we allow our eyes and communities to worship. As Jews have moved into the formal institutions of art history, and later into film, television, comics, games, and digital media, we've carried that tension with us into those places. A combination of hunger to create and wariness about what representations can actually do. Growing up, I always felt this low-grade tension between the commandment about graven images and the fact that I wanted deeply to be an artist. Nobody sat me down and said, "You can't draw, don't do this, it's against our religion, it's against our people." But the vibe around images was cautious enough that it made my sketchbook feel a little illicit. Then I read My Name is Asher Lev by Chaim Potok. This novel about a Hasidic kid whose painting life puts him in conflict with his community's expectations. Suddenly, I had language and a mirror. Here was a Jewish character whose art felt both like a calling and a problem. The book didn't resolve the tension for me, but it did something more important. It convinced me that diving deeper into Jewish art was exactly where I needed to go, no matter how complicated it got. The only thing standing between me and doing was permission. To this day, that early friction shapes my design choices. I think hard about where I place faces, how I handle sacred text, what I choose to make hypervisible, and what I leave abstract or symbolic. The tension between image and commandment isn't an obstacle anymore. It's part of the engine of my work. So that's the backdrop we carry into the next piece of the puzzle. What happens to flow and the aura of art when AI walks into the studio? Now, I want to braid in those two concepts a little bit more deeply, flow and the aura of art. Flow, in psychological language, is a state where challenge and skill are completely balanced. Time falls away, and you are fully absorbed in what you're doing. You're not bored, you're not overwhelmed, you're right at the edge of your abilities, immersed and feeling alive. In Jewish spiritual language, that state overlaps with kavanah, focused, heartfelt intention in your prayer, and with shefa, a sense of divine flow or abundance moving through you in creative or devotional work. Aura is a term some use to describe the presence of an original artwork in time and space, like Walter Benjamin. Feeling that this object or moment carries an unrepeatable history and a charge that a reproduction might not ever possess. When we argue about AI art, we're often also arguing about these things. Can a generated image carry aura? Where is the flow? In the human, in the system, or in the relationship between them? What counts as real, quote unquote, creativity in that mix, or is there any at all? Here is where a working definition to hold these two together can work. Creativity is not just producing something new. It is the ongoing relationship between a maker, a community, and a world in which ideas and forms are transformed with intention, risk, and responsibility. It includes the inner state of flow, the outer artifact, and the ethical consequences of what is made. So, by that definition, AI can clearly participate in the outer artifact layer. It can help generate image, texts, and sounds, but the inner layer, the flow, the shefa, the kavanah, that's still human. And the relationship layer, the responsibility to a community, to history, to people who will be shaped by this work, that's also still human. The question is really not, is AI creative in some abstract sense? The question is, who is holding intention and responsibility when these tools are used? My first taste of AI imagery was with Google's Deep Dream in 2015. I uploaded a photo mostly out of curiosity, hit the button, and then suddenly everything had eyeballs over it, eyes in the trees and the clouds and the background noise. But the model was over amplifying patterns it knew it had to detect. It was trippy and kind of funny, but I didn't really feel any artistic threat from it, if you can understand that. And then, almost a decade later, in 2021, when open source tools like Disco Diffusion arrived, something shifted. For the first time, I felt like I was getting somewhere visually. I could rough sketch out ideas of speculative Jewish spaces and symbols that would have taken me hours by hand. The resolution was low, the style inconsistent, and it definitely wasn't my quote unquote line or color language at all. But as a kind of sketch engine, it was useful. I started thinking of my outputs as raw material, elements I might collage into something more intentional later, not as finished pieces that I'd ever sign my name on. That experience set an early boundary for me. AI could sit at the conceptual and experimentation layer of my process, but the final artwork, especially in Jewish contexts, needed to pass back through my own hand, my own eye, and my own responsibility for what it means. And that brings us here to the bigger picture. We have people whose culture trains them in questioning, pattern making, and imaginative survival. We have commandments that treat images and stories as spiritual and psychologically potent. We have a modern history in which Jews are heavily involved in fields that build the stories and symbols of our modern life. That combination means Jews have had significant influence on the narratives and metaphors that move through mass media, even while often being misrepresented or attacked by those same systems. This is where Jewish futurism enters as an explicit ethical frame. Jewish futurism looks at this whole arc and says, we are not just making content, we are designing possible worlds. We know what happens when images are weaponized against us and other minorities. We also know how healing it is to encounter stories and visuals that hold our complexity and our future in front of us. So, if we're going to be present in art, design, media, and AI, Jewish futurism insists on treating narrative and technology as a kind of covenant. It asks questions like, what kind of Jewish futures are we normalizing through our work? Great question. Who is centered and who is erased in our speculative worlds? Who comes with us? How do we avoid reinforcing anti Semitic tropes or flattening others into caricatures? And how do we use our creative power to protect the vulnerable and expand the horizons of dignity and possibility? Earlier in my career, I spent a lot of time making slick animated ads, including what I felt like was my 50th cat litter spot. Technically, it was a good exercise, but at some point I realized I was pouring my skills into things that didn't line up with my values or my communities, even though we love cats. That dissonance became a compass. Around the same period, I started creating a series of infographics that broke down Jewish holidays into clear visual language, what they mean, where they come from, and how they're practiced. It was about 2009, and encoding Jewish knowledge into digestible, shareable graphics felt like a new move in information design. The audience was both non Jews and Jews who had never really been taught the origins of the days that they were celebrating. It was for beginners. Organizations like Hillel International, which supports Jewish life on campus and helps students navigate the holiday cycle, were working to make those same traditions approachable. Back then, my infographics plugged into that same impulse, and we started a social media campaign collaboration between Hillel and myself, but this time through a design lens. Those projects became a North Star for my ethics. If a piece of work helps people understand Jews and Judaism with more nuance, or gives Jews themselves a clearer, prouder sense of their own story, that leans towards a hell yes. If it flattens us into stereotypes, turns our symbols into cheap props, or asks me to ignore the humanity of Palestinians, black and brown communities, queer and trans folks, or anyone else I care about, that's a hard no for me, dog, no matter how nice the paycheck is. Which brings us to a question that's really at the heart of all this. What is all this Jewish creativity actually for? So, where does this leave us? We started with deceptively simple question. What is creativity really in a world of AI art and endless images? We saw that creativity can be understood as a path, mini c, little c, pro c, and big C, not as a binary on or off trait. We saw that Jewish life has long served as a creativity incubator, training people to question, to world build, and to find refuge in making. We revised our complex relationship with images and commandments, not as a ban on art, but as a deep awareness of art's power. We wrestled with AI, flow, the aura of art, and authorship. We named Jewish futurism as a way to take responsibility for our narrative and technological powers. For me, all this points towards a simple, demanding idea. Jewish creativity is not just about making beautiful things. It's about making livable worlds, inside and outside, where Jews and our neighbors can exist with dignity, complexity, and a sense of collective future. In 2024, I brought my work to Miami for Art Basel. Super huge moment. I was showing at the JADA Art Fair, and I had two pieces on display that were really cool, and they used augmented reality to layer speculative Jewish futures on top of physical images. People would hold up their phones, and suddenly there were new parts of the images, new motion, new things emerging from the image to the space around them. While folks were engaging this, an older woman in her late 70s or 80s spent some time with the work and then turned to me and said, You know, my father used to draw these futuristic cities and dream up new ways to be Jewish almost 100 years ago when he first got to the States after fleeing from Europe. You remind me of him. He would get so excited, and you have that same look of optimism in your eyes. Oh, that story hit me right in the kishkas. It landed really hard. In that moment, the work stopped just being about my own ideas and became part of a larger chain of people sketching Jewish futures under pressure. I felt this wave of joy and responsibility at the same time. Joy, I realized, is going to have to lead us forward. So I want to leave you with this. Given the history of the Jewish people, the commandments, our presence in creative fields, and our longing for home, what kind of worlds do you want to help build? With your hands, with your words, with your code, your heart, and your rituals. And who will get to live in those worlds with us? That's it for today's episode of the Jewish Futurism Lab. If this stirred something in you, please share it with somebody who's wrestling with AI, creativity, or Jewish life right now. I'm Mike Wirth. Thank you for listening, and I will see y'all in the future. Bezrat Hashem.